Hello and welcome to the Nutrition HO15 Final Exam Review. We're going to just hop right in and start covering the material. This section will cover chapters 1 through 3. So what is healthy? Well, we talked about this throughout the course. In general, we want to think of eating whole vegetables, fruits, whole grains, good fats, essentially our omega-3 fatty acids, moderate calorie intake along with physical activity. Limit the processed foods, limit processed meats, and refined grains. So all of our processing, all the processed foods. Of course, limiting alcohol intake, avoiding tobacco, and avoiding food additives. Of course, that goes along with limiting our processed foods. So why do we want to be healthy? Well, in order to decrease our risk of nutrition-related diseases, we need to take healthy steps in our life. So what are the leading causes of death in the U.S.? Well, let's start with number 1, which is heart disease. Number 2 is cancer. And then as we go down the list, you'll see that both strokes and diabetes are also in basically the top 6 causes of death in the nation. So these are the 4 major causes of death that are related to nutrition. Now, what is an essential nutrient? It's a nutrient that is needed by the body. It's necessary for health and survival. It can't be made by the body or cannot be made in sufficient amounts by the body. And it must be obtained from food. So what are these essential nutrients? Well, we started the course with them. They're water, carbohydrates, fat, protein, vitamins, and minerals. These are the 6 essential nutrients that you need for life. We all need for life. Now, which of these is energy yielding? Carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Remember, these are our macronutrients, the large nutrients. The food that we intake as carbohydrate, fat, and protein is then converted into energy by the body. And then it's measured as a calorie. So remember, a calorie is just a unit of energy, a unit of food energy. We like to think of carbohydrates as giving us 4 calories for every gram that we eat, and the same with protein, whereas fat is over double that at 9 calories per gram. Now, in general, the theme throughout this entire course has been to eat whole foods and to stay away from processed foods. And just beginning with this section, I want to reiterate that. Remember that you will need to recognize what a whole food is as opposed to a processed food. I don't want you to get fooled with, labels such as whole grain, thinking that something like Cheerios is a whole food. Cheerios is not a whole food. It's a very processed food. So you start with what it looked like in nature. You have a wheat plant. This is what it looks like in nature. This little circle here looks absolutely nothing like it did in nature. So how many steps of processing do you think had to go from taking this and converting it into this? Now, what happens with a whole versus processed food? Every step of processing removes nutrients. At the same time as nutrients are removed, they then have to add back in some nutrients, and you can see vitamins and minerals, but also food additives. So it's the loss of naturally occurring nutrients and the addition of food additives. I also want to point out that don't get fooled by vitamins and minerals being added or showing up in the ingredient list. Most of your vitamins are made in China. They're not squeezed out from a piece of fruit and then added to your Cheerio. They're made in China in a processing lab and then shipped across seas and then added to your Cheerio. So what we want to do is focus on whole foods, and whole foods are generally nutrient-dense foods. And nutrient density, basically, is saying that a food is very high in nutrients, so vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients, along with fiber. It's not going to have the added sugar and the processed fats, trans fats, the excess sodium that gets added, and the food additives. I already mentioned this. Our macronutrients are 3 energy-yielding nutrients. you need to know what percent of the diet they should be. So carbohydrates should be about 45 to 65%. Fat should be about 20 to 35%. And protein, remember the range is 10 to 35, but really most Americans need only about 10% to 15% of their diet from protein. Most Americans only need 10 to 15% of their diet from protein. And this is what a diet might look like between the carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And remember, it's always going to add up to 100%. Now we think about the recommended intake levels. Remember the DRI committee establishes these, and they start by measuring a population and what they need. And I have an example here of, say, calcium, the calcium requirement, which for most adults is about 1,000 milligrams. And this is just to show you that person A might need a little less, person C might need more, person B right in the middle. What they do is they take the measurements of all the people or a subset of people and get an average. This is called the EAR, or the estimated average requirement. Now the recommended daily allowance, recommended dietary allowance, or how much you would need per day, is always set at 98% of this, basically of this data on this bell curve. So as many people can meet the recommended intake level as possible. And they don't put it way out here because of the upper intake level. You don't want to reach toxicity for the individuals that need less. So that's how the RDA is established. Remember, the EER is the estimated energy requirement. And same thing, they basically took a look at the population, established that the average calorie intake needed for an individual is about 2,000 calories. Some people might need 1,400, some people might need 26 or even 3,000 calories a day, but the average is about 2,000. This average is placed right at the estimated energy requirement, or the average, because we don't want to start telling people they should consume about 3,000 calories per day. Remember, the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, as the most research. So I'm going to call it the research bedrock. A lot of research to support the recommendations. If you ever see an AI or an adequate intake, it means that it's more of an educated guess based on the research. But it may not have as much research as we'd like to have, and therefore we can't really make a RDA, or a recommended dietary allowance. I talked a little bit about the upper limit, the reason we don't want to recommend too much of a nutrient for everybody, and the reason is that it can get into a toxic range. And most people, think about, oh, everything's pretty safe, and then it goes into the danger range, like you're just going to jump off a cliff or something like that. But the reality is there's a very safe area with a marginal amount both on the high and low side, meaning that there's a risk of deficiency as well as toxicity, and this is with every vitamin and mineral. So some are going to have a little broader spectrums than others, some will have a little bit narrower. So too little, and there will be deficiency, and too much, there can be toxicity. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I do expect you to know some of these basics. Food groups offer us different types of nutrients, and that's why you want to eat from all the food groups. Now, of course, if you're a vegetarian or vegan, you don't have to eat meat or dairy. You'll see there's definitely overlap between a lot of these vitamins and minerals between the groups. But in general, we think of our fruit and vegetable group as having vitamin A, C, potassium, and fiber, with vegetables having that additional folate and a little bit of magnesium. Grains are really where we're going to get our B vitamins, but also fiber, iron, and magnesium. Now, meat is important. A couple things to point out. Definitely iron, particularly with the beef. We also see the magnesium and zinc, so we think more of our heavy metals. But also B12. Remember, B12 only occurs in animal products. Legumes and nuts, again, we have the protein, the fiber, the folate. vitamin E, and also some essential fatty acids within this group, especially with the nuts. Dairy in particular, you can get B12. Remember, this is an animal product as well as riboflavin. One thing that's important is that vitamin A and D are only found in dairy when it's fortified. Our oils tend to offer us most of our essential fatty acids and vitamin E. If we think about a fruit versus a vegetable, we know that a fruit is a plant which includes the seeds of that plant. And I always use the tomato as a great example because you have this plant and then the seeds are within that plant. We usually think of a tomato as a vegetable, and every cook still would. So this is more of a botanist definition, versus a culinary definition. Everything else, every other part of the plant is the vegetable. So the roots and the stems and the leaves, this is the flower. The broccoli is the flower. So that's going to be a vegetable. Your fruit and vegetable groups are going to be divided further. When we think about our colors and our starchy vegetables, and it's because even within the fruit and vegetable group, there's going to be a different variety or different types of nutrients within those groups. So eating a variety of whole fruits and vegetables is important. When you eat a variety of whole fruits and vegetables, you will obtain more phytonutrients, also known as phytochemicals. These are biologically active substances in plants that we believe offer us some health protection and that help us fight against chronic disease. They are not essential nutrients, but some people are starting to call them more essential because we're beginning to understand that they have a greater and greater impact on our health and on our disease risk. They mostly act as antioxidants, but not entirely. There are a number of functions. These are the ones that I want you to know. You do not have to know examples of which foods contain phytonutrients. Now, as an antioxidant, remember an antioxidant is going to quench a free radical. There are free radicals. Basically, we come in contact with them every day. What they can do is they're very unstable. They want to bond to proteins, to DNA, to cell membranes, lipid membranes, and then they cause damage. And what happens to that damage is it causes this domino effect that usually leads us down the line to a chronic disease such as cancer. An antioxidant essentially blocks the progression of this domino effect. We're already on to chapter 3 material, so I'm going to start going through all the digestive organs. And you do need to know each of the organs and exactly what the function is. We're going to start with the mouth, and its mechanical function is chewing and crushing. I think everybody knows that. Remember, this is where digestion begins, particularly carbohydrate digestion. The enzymes in saliva will actually start digesting the starch. As we go from the mouth down the esophagus and into the stomach. So the stomach is going to grind and churn, kind of like your washing machine. And it's going to take all those food contents and then produce it into what's called a chyme. So it's going to be more of a paste. Your stomach releases hydrochloric acid, and this is what brings it down to a very low pH. Remember, this is important. This is where protein digestion really begins because the protein becomes uncoiled in the stomach. And it's the low pH that uncoils the protein. But the stomach is protected because it has a mucus that is released to protect it from actually getting burned. Remember, those contents can actually be pushed back up into the esophagus and cause heartburn because it's such a low pH. Once it goes from the stomach, it'll actually go into the intestines, seen here. And remember, the intestines, this is the most important organ in digestion and absorption. There are enzymes that are released to help with digestion or the breakdown of food. And then those food nutrients are absorbed, pulled into the bloodstream. Carbohydrate, protein, and fat enzymes are all released from the pancreas, also within the lining of the intestines. So the pancreas, seen right here, is very important in digestion because of the release of these enzymes. And remember, an enzyme is really what helps break down those bigger food components say, a starch into the smaller molecules, such as a glucose, to be digested. The liver, which is seen here, produces bile, while the gallbladder stores bile. And lastly is the colon, which absorbs water, minerals, and some of the fibers. There's some fiber that'll get digested by the bacteria within the colon, and that can be absorbed, but for the most part, that does go through undigested. So lastly, in this video, we're going to finish up with the storage systems. Remember, the three areas where food nutrients are stored are the liver, the muscles, and the fat cells. When we eat carbohydrates, remember the plant storage form of carbohydrates is starch that is broken down into glucose, and that is stored in the liver and the muscle first. Whatever's left over then goes to the fat cells. Fat, if we take that in, is broken down into a fatty acid and then gets stored in the fat cells, also called adipose cells. Protein is broken down into amino acids, but it's not really stored, although there is an amino acid pool. For the most part, it is either utilized for its many functions that we need protein for, or it gets converted and stored as fat. So this is going to finish up the first section of the final exam review.